So we've talked a little bit about the emergency temporary standard and the application, how you figure out the 100 employees. What about the exemptions that are based on either medical conditions or religious exceptions? How does that play into this?
For those employers who decide on a vaccine mandate, you can mandate vaccines for anyone unless they have a medical exemption that requires accommodations under the ADA, or who have a sincerely held religious belief against vaccination that would entitle them to some protection under Title VII. So in either one of those situations, an employer is required to sort of go through the interactive process with those employees to determine whether the basis for the exemption request, whether it's legitimate and legally recognized. And in the case of medical exemption, it is the process that we're familiar with under the ADA, which is you can ask your employee to provide appropriate medical information to make a determination about whether there is a disability that requires an accommodation or would work against having someone be fully vaccinated against COVID. And then from there, if you determine that that the medical condition is one that needs to be accommodated, what accommodations might be reasonable? And there are a range of things that you can do. Many of them are already in place. Simple ones: plexiglass barriers, physical distancing, staggered work shifts,
working from home.
And so there are a variety of things that can be done simply. And employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations, and accommodations are reasonable as long as they don't create an undue burden on the employer. But undue burden is actually a pretty high bar for employers, and it is something that constitutes a substantial difficulty or expense. And so if you get to the point as an employer where you're thinking there aren't any accommodations that you can implement without it being an undue burden, be sure that you have gone through the entire list of things, because when you get to the end of that, if you decide you can't do it, that's when courts scrutinize the options that were available to you, and they want to be sure that you've explored every last option before you make that determination. So I think the area where I see employers consistently get into trouble from a legal standpoint in this area is when they sort of determine upfront that's not really a legitimate reason for an accommodation. So I'm not really going to go through the interactive process, or I'm going to go through it, but I really know what the answer is already. And I think what the best practice is to go through that process with an open mind to see whether there is something that you can do, eliminate all the possibilities, make sure that you create a clear record of what you've considered and what your thinking was, so that you have that in the event that it comes up. But at the end of the day, if you determine there isn't anything that you can do, be sure that you've explored all of the options that might be available.
So let's drill down into this remote workplace question. We've lived through pushing on 2 years now where the worm has turned and everyone's entire workplace has gotten turned upside down. Folks have had to close their businesses and push their entire workforce remote. They're trying to get some of their employees back into the office. Different businesses are being more or less aggressive about that. Others are really leaning into a different model in terms of having more of a far-flung workforce. But we definitely have shown in a lot of different workplaces an ability to accommodate people working remotely. What does that look like, Maureen? I mean, are you seeing clients that have got employees that are really pushing for a remote workplace disability accommodation, and how does that play out?
I have seen it, and I think that if you have employees who have been working effectively from home for almost 2 years, I think it's going to be hard to get them to, I think it's going to be hard to justify requiring them to come back into the office if they have a disability that prevents them from being vaccinated or following other protocols. If they've been working effectively from home, I think that's going to be a hard argument to make. I wouldn't want to be in court making that argument that you are requiring them to come back.
I can give the countervailing view there. The ADA is pretty clear that you can provide an accommodation like remote work temporarily, but that if you've got a public-facing job and being in the office is a core requirement of the position, then simply because you provided remote work as an accommodation on a temporary basis doesn't mean that you can't pull it back. But I do agree it's a little bit tricky to be in that situation where the employee has a legitimate need for an accommodation. You've provided remote work as that accommodation, and you pull it back.
And I think it really depends on the nature of the workplace, the nature of the position. Some people have been able to work from home more effectively than others, and that's not going to be consistent across the board.
Might be doable for me as a lawyer to be able to draft contracts from home, but I kind of can't be a bank teller from home.
Right.
Exactly. And any retail positions in particular, we're finding that there's some resistance to getting people back in the workplace, and positions that where the employer is concerned a lot about things like the overall working of the business, team efficiency, if you will. We'd like to have everybody back in the office because things work better that way, and there is legitimacy to that. But when you've got it in this context, though, it makes it really difficult to say, okay, we know we've done that for you to this point, but now it's time for you to come back in.
So I take it the difficulty with answering some of these questions is they're very fact specific and very case by case. So there's not really a blanket answer for how it's going to work.
Yeah, and the one thing that we know absolutely is that no matter what the condition is or what the accommodation is, that the employer has to engage in an individualized assessment for each worker as to what the facts are and what the right outcome is.